Hi, I'm Maddie,
And I'm Abigail, and this is
two writers.
Many Wrongs. Two writers, many story engines. Maddie and I thought that it would be fun to do a back to basics series where we're going to talk about different elements of writing and kind of those basic building blocks of when you start a story. So today we're going to start off those back to basics by talking about story engines.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear from you about Story Engine specifically because you teach it,
Mhm.
and then kind of seeing how we can kind of expand that conversation with our different ideologies, maybe about writing and exploring it a little bit, maybe breaking the rules a little bit.
I love breaking the rules with you. I think that one of the things that we have discovered in this podcast is that basically everything comes back to like our gardener versus architect backgrounds. And I have a theory that I want to run past you about story
All right,
engines that they also relate to gardener and architect.
sure.
So I feel as though um, to some extent, if you are a gardener, a pantser, you are more focused on character. And if you are an architect or a planner, you are more focused on plot. And the reason why I think that is because as a gardener, I let my characters tell me where they're going. And I feel like as an architect, you have laid out and focused on the entire plot before you get started. What do you think about that?
I think that's fairly true, at least in when it comes to us,
Hmm.
because I definitely have the plot all figured out. But I think the fun is when I'm writing is I get to know the characters. Like I didn't know who these people were that were going on this adventure,
Yeah.
and that kind of surprises me along the way.
Yeah, that's really fun. So just going back to basics, because I jumped the gun here a little bit because I was so excited about my theory. Story engines in a traditional sense are what is driving your story. What's the engine of it, right? And a lot of times we think about that as like what is getting your readers to continue reading. And the two traditional story engines that we'll start talking about, and then we're going to explore some other areas is character driven and plot driven. So Maddie, can you explain the character versus plot driven engines?
I will do my best. Pop quiz. So for a character-driven narrative, it's your characters are what's propelling the action forward. You're reading the story to get to know these characters, and they are the reason you want to keep reading. Whereas plot is you're reading it to find out what happens next. Like I need to read the
Mhm.
next thing to figure out what's going on next. That's not to say that they can't have an interesting plot if it's character driven or can't have interesting characters if it's plot driven. It's just what is the main motivation that causes your readers to move forward? Because if
Right.
it's the character and you're not, it's not so much like, oh, what are they gonna do? It's more like how are they going to develop as a person as the narrative goes along.
Exactly. It's much more about internal conflict versus external conflict happening. And one of the things that, like you said, I do teach this. So one of the things that I kind of tell my students is sometimes your genre is also going to dictate which story engine you're working with because when we think of things like literary fiction or romance, that's very character driven. It's very internal. You think of like Pride and Prejudice, very literary. Not a whole lot happens. There is obviously plot, Lydia runs away and gets married and yada yada yada, but it's very much about the internal journey of the characters
Mhm.
versus something like a mystery novel or an adventure. You think of things like Ready Player One or like The Martian, some of those sci-fi books. They're much more plot driven. And I specifically bring up The Martian because I think it's a really, really great example of a balance between the character and plot-driven engines. For those of you who haven't read The Martian or seen the movie, Andy Weir wrote it. He's a fantastic author. But it is about this guy, Mark, who is abandoned on
Mars.
Mars, right? Yes, thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Abandoned on Mars. and has to find a way to get home. So it's him by himself for the most part. I mean, there are other characters, whatever, but it's his internal journey along with the plot driving us forward of him trying to get home. Like, I personally think that that book is like a perfect balance of character versus plot.
I was reading an article by Lincoln Michael earlier today about story engines. I just want to shout him out because it was a really great article and I agreed with most of his points. But he was talking about how, like, in a novel, it
Hmm.
might make more sense to have multiple engines driving you forward because it's a long way to
Yeah.
from the beginning to the end. So sometimes it takes multiple engines to power you all the way through.
Hmm.
I really love The Martian, the internal journey of this character who's mostly by himself and like being
Hmm.
able to have a character who's mostly like inner monologuing and make them so interesting and watching them develop is such a cool mechanic. There's so much
Hmm.
personality, but you're also like on the edge of your seat trying to like, oh, this problem happened. How is he going to solve it? But I think that's a really great example of both of those engines and how two of them can work together.
Right. And I always think of story engines as being on a spectrum because you really have to have both to some extent to make your story interesting for your reader, but there is generally one is more powerful than the other. It's like a hybrid car. You
Yeah.
switch gears, you use both, but it depends which one is really powering it more so. Um, and I find that sci-fi lends itself really, really well to having both aspects very, very balanced because you have to have that humanity to help us connect to it. But again, when we think of an example like The Martian, it is structured in that there is accident after accident after accident after accident. It's all very cause and effect, which is generally one of the hallmarks of a plot-driven narrative, is
Mhm.
that cause and effect, because that's what forces your character to move forward.
Right.
Yeah. So just thinking about like plot driven, just some hallmarks of a plot driven narrative is that there's external conflict. Generally, there's like a series of challenges or a series of like enemies. Your character is trying to reach an end goal. And then, really, as a writer, we use our characters as tools for the plot. We use them to kind of move the story forward through the plot. The opposite is true of a character-driven story in which you are using the plot to facilitate your character's inner growth.
Mhm.
So the character is the thing that's really the star of it, and the plot is just helping them get to that point. So again, going back to Pride and Prejudice, we see, there are several examples of Elizabeth and Darcy running into each other, and those are all plot points, but each one is intended to have those characters grow in a certain direction. So I feel like, again, you have to have both, but one of them is the characters are helping facilitate the plot, and one of them is the plot is helping facilitate the characters.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think like if you were, I know you're not, but if you were
Mhm.
to map a character-driven story, would you map the character like what where you wanted them to start and where you wanted them to end and what kind of truths you wanted to reveal about them along the way?
So I would. So even though I'm a gardener, my type of writing is very character driven, and I specifically think about like where I want the character to start and where I want them to end. And so like with my first novel, I knew it was going to be cyclical, um, because it's not. Um, this sounds so silly. It's not the time for my characters to fully heal. Like that would not be a believable journey. This is the first time that they've tried to heal. So I knew that they were going to have to end up essentially where they started, but I wanted it to be like a two steps forward, one step back kind of story. Um, and so I really tried to think about each character and what would those two steps forward, one step back look like for them. And then I found the plot points to help me facilitate that journey. The hard thing is it's a dual POV. So I had to make sure that those plot points both like intertwined, but then were individual enough for each of the characters to have their own growth, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what about you in your writing? Do you think that you're more character driven or plot driven or something else?
So before I do want to talk about something else
Mhm,
eventually because I think it does play into my writing, but I think I'd like to stick with foundational stuff.
mhm,
I would say that my story is probably more plot driven is like the
mhm,
main engine, but I do care a lot about my characters.
mhm,
And it's important to me that they each have their own little journey from where they start and where they go. I really like to use the plot in a way to explore these characters. And maybe sometimes the plot takes a little bit of back seat while I let these characters develop and show how they're going to react to the things that are around them because I something I've always loved about science fiction is having these really very human feeling characters who are going through these relationship challenges while also being in space and all
mhm,
these wacky things happening and explosions in space even though there's no oxygen in space.
mhm,
um and just watching them react and like
mhm,
those things sometimes are more memorable. Like when I think back to Star Trek, sometimes I'm thinking about like the character growth of Seven of Nine rather than that really cool episode where they the Year of Hell or something. I don't know.
mhm.
Just throwing out a random example. But
That's fine.
sometimes it's just sometimes the characters do become more memorable than the plot itself if you
Mhm.
give them the opportunity to shine and you can kind of switch it around as you're writing.
Yeah. And again, I think that that's the thing that people maybe don't necessarily understand when I talk about like character versus plot, because they're not really versus, like they're not one or the other. It's just which one is the star at a certain point. Um, and you have to have both. I'm not going to care about your, blow 'em up bank heist if I don't know that the person doing it is trying to, pay for his child to go to college or something. Like we want to have those internal motivations. I
Hmm.
also have no interest in reading a book about somebody that nothing happens. Like postmodernism is not my shit at all. The whole there is no plot. Listen, I read The Stranger in AP Lit and Lang. I have zero interest in it. I read The Crying of Lot 49. There's no fucking plot. Nothing happens. Like, I don't care. Um, and so it's just
Uh,
like you have to have both. And again, when we're talking about these foundational basics, we're talking about it from a reader's perspective. What is keeping your reader turning the page? Like,
mhm.
that's really the question that you're asking, not, you know, do you have more character or more plot, but why is your reader sticking around?
Right. Um, so when it comes to story engines, is that something that you figure out along the way, or is it something you know when you start your project?
Um, I I kind of think that story engines are almost as foundational as gardening and architecture. Um, just in my own experience, I think it's the same thing that you can play around with it. You can try different things, but I think when it comes down to it, like you are a certain type of writer. Just because every story I've ever produced is about the characters. Like I am much more interested in the internal lives of these people than necessarily what happens to them.
Hmm.
And I think that that can be said of a lot of authors. When you look at an author's body of work, um, most of their books are going to be around the same story engine. And again, that's not to say that they can't expand. Please don't make fun of me. It's just because I love her. You know what's
Jody,
coming.
Jody Pico, I'm not making fun of you. I like it. It's cute.
She has so many good
It
books that are great
warms my
examples.
heart out of love.
She has a book called Spark of Light, which is about a shooting that happens at an abortion clinic.
Hmm.
That is very, very, very plot driven. However, the way that she tells it focuses on the characters. Every single person that's in the clinic, the shooter, the police negotiator outside, like it is focused on the characters. So even when you have this really plot-driven story, writing characters is who she is, like when it comes down to it. So I think it's something that you can maybe play with, but it's kind of who you are foundationally as a writer. Um, Go ahead and argue with me.
I don't know why you think I'm gonna argue. I think that there's some truth to that, but I think like there's probably an engine that you're more inclined to. That doesn't mean
Hmm.
that you don't not, you're not capable of doing a different engine. It's
Yeah.
just which one are you more naturally drawn to? And I think that's
Hmm.
totally fine to lean into that. Um, but I did want to kind of talk about when you're first starting a story, I think it is important to establish what engine you're going to use
Hmm.
because that's kind of foundationally the structure of your book. Like, what is driving the plot forward? If you don't know if it's character or plot, then it's kind of going to be a mess. However, I think it's important that you ask yourself, why am I writing this story? Like,
Hmm.
what point am I trying to make here? Is it like I want you to learn about this type of person and the journey that they go on, or do you want to write a story about like a specific action that's happening. So taking the time to think about the reason why you want to write this story, I think will help you
Hmm.
figure out which engine will be best for that. But also, if you're writing your story and you're starting to notice like it doesn't feel like the plot's moving along. I mean, the story, I should say the story,
Hmm.
that the story doesn't really it feels stalled. Maybe
Hmm.
you're using the wrong engine.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. I mean, my first book is very, very, very character driven. My second book has a lot more plot involved. And because it has a lot more plot involved, I really had to find myself doing more of the planning that I normally wouldn't have because I have to make sure that everything makes sense, that everything lines up. I know you look so surprised, but I'm going to take that as pride instead of instead of mild amusement.
No, no, no. It's I'm very proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you. I would
Because
never.
because we're mixing things up. That's why we're learning from each other is we're each like pulling a little bit from each other and making each other stronger.
Right,
That's why
exactly. I
we
mean,
do this.
well, and it just like talking about this too really makes me think of our talk with Kristen Harmel, which she was talking about her first two agents basically saying like, yeah, I don't think you can switch genres. Like, I don't think you have a historical fiction in you because she had been writing what she called chick lit. And I feel like you have to have that community of writers around you who just believes you can do anything because we as writers have to explore all of these different opportunities. I mean, it's so funny to me now because Kristen Harmel is known for her historical fiction.
Right.
Like she is a master of that genre. And a master of balancing plot and character as well.
For sure.
Um, but like, you have to play around to see what works for you. And I love you talking about like, why are you writing this story? Because I think that that gives us so much clarity on story engine. It gives us clarity on, the plot. Where is this going? It gives us clarity on the character arcs. Like knowing the purpose behind your story, it just, to me, it's one of the number one ways to combat writer's block.
Oh, totally. I think sometimes when I get lost in my book and my edits, I like to
Hmm.
write down my why. Like, why are you writing
Hmm.
this book? And that's not necessarily a philosophical question. It's like,
Hmm.
why would you want somebody to read this book?
Yeah.
What reason are they picking this book up and reading it? What are you looking for them to get out of it?
Hmm.
And just fundamentally circling back to that can help motivate you
Hmm.
and help you find the correct engine to propel you forward or a mixture of engines that you want to use, a
Yeah.
hybrid, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And we spent a lot of time talking about character versus plot because I think that those are the most well-known story engines, and I think that they're the ones that are most typical. But you were telling me about the article that you read, and it was really interesting because we've been talking about them from a reader's perspective of what is getting your reader continue flipping the page. But the article you said talked about it from a writer's perspective. So what, like, tell our readers some about that because it was really interesting when you were talking to me about it.
Okay, so this was something that I knew. I knew that you there wasn't just like a box of the character or the plot and you pick one or the other. I
Hmm.
knew that there were other ways of driving a plot forward, but I had kind of forgotten until I was reading this article. And Lincoln Michael was talking about how in his eyes, if from a writer's perspective, there's multiple ways that can drive your story forward. And that can
Hmm.
be pretty much any craft element, from theme to linguistics
Ooh.
to form.
Yeah.
And I specifically, my thesis and the essay that I wrote for my MFA was about form because that was my story engine when I was writing my short story collection was form. I was always driven by a form. I'd start with a form. Like for instance, I have one that's like a documentary, a mock documentary. And
Hmm.
so I started with that form and I knew nothing else. Like I just knew that I wanted to write a documentary. And
Huh.
so as I was writing the documentary, I started to like fill in details about what sort of story I wanted to tell. But I really wanted to be able to use this idea of having your camera be a character because
Hmm.
this is something that Ted Chiang did in his book, and I really wanted to do that too, where I made the character of the camera, where the camera is like just seeing what's happening,
Hmm.
but like pans over and shows you something. It's almost like the camera itself is trying to communicate with you. So I'm like, what kind of story can
Uh-huh.
I tell? And then I went to setting. So I wanted to put it
Hmm.
in the sci-fi world that I already have created and then tried to see like what kind of stuff could I put into it in that would fit in that format that I could tell a
Hmm.
story through a script, through just people talking and then the camera kind of showing you things and clips. And I built it from there. And that was the engine that started it, was the form of it.
Hmm.
I also picked the form of an FAQ article. So that's something as a technical
Ooh.
writer, I wrote all the time.
Hmm.
So frequently asked questions. So
Hmm.
it's like a frequently asked questions page for the muses, as in like artistic
Ooh. Yeah.
inspiration. So I basically was like, I'm gonna do an FAQ, and
Hmm.
that's the plot. And then I was like, okay, so now I need to pick what's the story? And I'm like, we'll do the muses. Like we're
Hmm.
contacting the muses and asking frequently asked questions. And the
Hmm.
story just like developed from there as I was writing the questions and the answers and like the snark kind of came out. And that was what drove my story forward was the idea of how I wanted this form and what that form looked like. And
Hmm.
that informed the way the story fell apart. I mean, like fell apart, but like went forward
Yeah.
and
Unfolded.
unfolded. That's a much better word.
Yeah.
Thank you. But I think it's just what is the thing that when you sit
Hmm.
down that your goal is when you're writing, because
Yeah.
like for you can start with that.
Hmm.
I another thing that he talked about linguistically, I thought was really interesting because I'd never really thought of this before. But he talked about doing an exercise where you write a sentence,
Hmm.
any sentence. So I'm actually going to reference the article.
Yeah, go
One
for it. I love
second.
that.
Okay. So the language engine. So he has this exercise that he does with his students and where you write a sentence at the top of the paper. And this one is, my mother always said she wanted to die by the ocean.
Hmm.
And then you circle two or three keywords. So
Hmm.
mother, death, ocean. And then you write 10 to 20 words you associate with those words. So
Ooh.
water, dry, drink, father, waves, desert, children, swim, splash, pool, sea, thirst, towel, sun, sunscreen. And then you write a story where every sentence uses at least one of those words in every sentence. And that's what's driving your story forward is using those those words over and over again to create like this word pattern that links it until it grows into a story.
That is amazing. And I want to do that so badly.
Right. It sounds
Well, it
so
makes me
fun.
think of okay, hold on. You pulled out your reference. I have to pull up my reference really, really quickly. Um because it
But
makes me think of poetry form, a sestina. Have you heard of a sestina poem?
yeah,
That's what it makes me think of, is like you have to have that word at the end of every single thing, and then the last stanza are all six of those words.
right, right. But I think it's such a cool thing because, again, as a writer, what's
Hmm.
driving you forward is like, okay, my next sentence has to have a word that relates to water
Hmm.
in some way. But when the reader is reading it, maybe they're like, the story's character driven.
Hmm.
They don't know that the
Right.
way the story started out wasn't you weren't even you didn't have characters in mind, you didn't have a plot in mind,
Hmm.
you had a specific set of words that you wanted to
Hmm.
use. Also talking about like themes, like doing like
Hmm.
maybe a theme of up and down. And so
Yeah.
having this like constant teeter-totter in the story
Hmm.
of up and down, even like on a sentence or paragraph level, where like maybe the reader doesn't even notice that that's what you're doing, but then that theme starts to come through because you keep using like the language of up and down
Hmm.
over and over again as you progress through your story.
I love this because I've never thought of story engines in this way before. So I think that this is all kind of opening my mind to not just like new possibilities, but also recategorizing things that I've done in the past. So again, when teaching, I'll do different lectures. Like one of my favorite lectures to do is on cliches and like how to avoid cliche. And we do exercises based on that topic. So, like one of the things I have is, how would Batman say it's raining cats and dogs and like take that cliche and make it specific to that character kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, but I do the same thing with like my dialogue lecture. We then do an exercise completely focused on dialogue and same with setting. And so all of these exercises that I do to try to talk about these different elements of writing, like I never realized like, oh shit, that's a story engine. Like the prompt is the story engine.
Yeah, and
That's so interesting.
I think it's really freeing and exciting for as a writer to let go and be like, okay, who's controlling this? Is it the character or the plot? Because
Hmm.
that kind of gets, that's reductive. So
Hmm.
being able to be like, you know what, write a story that the only thing I know is the setting, and we just see what
Hmm.
happens. And that kind
Yeah.
of that's magical to be
Hmm.
able to see where that goes and keeping
Yeah.
that like the central point of your story.
Well, and it also makes me think about, so one of my favorite authors as well is Pat Conroy. And one of the things I love about his writing is how beautiful and lyrical the setting description is. And like I have tried to write like him before, and it's not necessarily in my wheelhouse because when I do it, somehow it just feels like overwhelming and sappy and whatever. But reading his books, the description and the setting is so enticing. Like that is part of what's keeping me reading. And that's not character or plot. I mean, his books, if we were just putting them in those boxes, are definitely more character driven. But what's keeping me personally reading is his descriptions. So I love that we're expanding this notion of what the engine behind your story is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very freeing because I think I'm gonna go back to when I was an undergrad.
Hmm.
Once I graduated, my mentor said, "Okay, do you guys remember everything I've taught you about like the rules, the basics of writing?"
Hmm.
And we're like, "Yes." And she's like, "You took all the notes, you really thoroughly understand all these rules." And we said yes. And she goes, "Okay, now your job is to break them." And that was the end of the class. That's how she left us after
Hmm.
undergrad. And I was like, really like what? Like what was the point of teaching me that? But you can't successfully break the rules
Hmm.
until you know them.
Hmm.
And I
Well,
think this is kind of breaking the rules a little bit. And I love
right, and
that.
that's the thing is that like I've had that conversation with students before of like if you're going to break the rules, you have to break them well. Like it's not about breaking the rules, it's about getting away with it. Because if you try to break the rules just to be avant-garde and like, I'm not like other writers kind of bullshit, your story's going to read false and everyone's going to say, why didn't they follow the rules? Like, the rules are there for a reason. But if you can get away with breaking the rules, and like you said, if you use that writing exercise with those 20 words and in your mind, you're like, getting away with it, the reader has no idea that that's what you did. Like, that is masterfully getting away with breaking the rules of using a different story engine, and your reader has no idea.
That's the
Um,
goal.
yeah, exactly. That's the goal, is that your audience does not notice. So like Sally Rooney is known for not using punctuation when writing dialogue. Personally, it drives me crazy. I think she's a great writer. I'm not shit talking anybody here. I have to listen to her books on audio because I cannot read them without the punctuation. But other people who love her works, they don't even notice it. Like they've gotten so used to the way she breaks the rules that it doesn't bother them whatsoever, you
Yeah.
know? So the
I
goal is to get away with it.
Yeah, I think if you're going to experiment with like different types of story engines, I think it
Hmm.
might be helpful to like try it with flash fiction. Like
Yeah.
my FAQ did that, and
Hmm.
like because there's not as much at stake in flash fiction, and even like having a
Hmm.
character or plot based flash fiction can be heavy, and maybe the story isn't
Yes.
satisfying because you don't have enough room to
Hmm.
expand, but it also gives you like a lot more wiggle room to
Hmm.
experiment with that form because like you said, it's about getting away with it. So you want to break the rules, but you want to break them well. You're not breaking the rules just to break them. You
Exactly.
know, you don't, because if you break them and people catch you, then you're like
Hmm.
a bad thief. You want
Exactly.
you want to run away with something and then not
Hmm.
even notice that you stole something. So
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
a street magician who like
Hmm.
pickpockets you while they're doing
Right.
magic tricks for you. That's what you
Well,
want to do.
exactly. And like, we're not encouraging stealing, by the way. I
No.
mean,
Oh,
if you can get away with it, but don't. Like, just saying. Doing it in flash fiction, like practicing these different story engines, practicing breaking the rules in this way is like the lead up to the heist. Like when you watch Ocean's 11 and they have that whole fake, vault set up and they're practicing, that is writing the flash fiction. And once you master that, if you want to take it to a longer form, if you want to try and write a novel out of that, you have the skills to do that. Um, but I think that that's why, again, thinking about like what I teach, talking about the article that you read, like all of these are presented to us as writing exercises. They're not presented to, hey, go write your book this way. It's, hey, this is a way to test yourself, to flex a new muscle, to gain a new skill, and to practice. And then you can put that into your writing later on.
right. I definitely think that probably these forms are a little bit more difficult than going
Hmm.
for more traditional ways of forming your story.
Hmm.
And I do want to make a quick little note here that if you are somebody who writes flash fiction or short fiction and that's like your main medium,
Hmm.
we are by no means saying that like that's practice writing. I was just saying it's
Yes.
the stakes are a lot lower in
Hmm.
the shorter word count to
Hmm.
explore that, but it's not demeaning that art at all because that's a whole art in itself.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are so many reasons why when we are in school, we focus on the short form because it is all of the building blocks there that you need. You have to be able to master the short form before you can move into a longer form because mastering a short form is so difficult. Like, it really, my students hate it. They want to go and they want to write their big, long, epic novel, and it's a mess because they don't know how to write a short form where every single word counts. You really have to focus on what's most important because, like you said, you're not going to have time to have these huge character arcs where they learn something gigantic. Like, you are going to be able to solve one problem, not all the problems. And it takes so much discipline to do short form well that like it really is just an art into itself. So I completely second what Maddie's saying. We are not saying that short form is a practice run for longer forms. We're saying it's the more difficult thing to master.
Definitely.
You have to be able to do that as a writer first.
Yeah, and so if I could go back to
Hmm.
technical writing for a
Yeah.
second, because I would write like technical articles, they'll be like like 5 to 10 pages. I could write that like in an hour or two, no problem,
Hmm.
easy. But I would have to write the text for a button that was 2 words. That would take me 2 days
Yeah.
because like the less space you have, the less words you have, the harder it
Hmm.
is because
Exactly.
you've only this much to communicate a bigger
Hmm.
idea. And how do you do that? So I think sometimes these smaller forms are harder to
Oh,
write,
absolutely. I mean,
but less stakes.
well, and
And
it's one of the reasons why I find poetry so difficult is because every single word counts.
yes, yeah. But I
Mhm.
think it's good to practice those forms. And
Mhm.
I mean, I wouldn't say you have to master short stories to write a novel
Mhm.
because that's a difficult task to do. But be able
Yes.
to do like the basic building blocks of telling a
Mhm.
story well enough that you can expand it into something bigger.
Mhm.
But you start with something smaller because it's a lot easier to manage before you
Mhm.
commit to something much larger.
Yeah.
Um,
And especially when experimenting with these different forms, you want to start with a small experiment before you take it wide scale. Um, so it's much easier to focus on something like a Q&A in a short form or
yeah.
a theme in a short form, than trying to write an entire book that is a Q&A.
Right. So I would start with like if I'm going to use this form,
Hmm.
let me see if I even like it. Like maybe you're like, oh, that'll
Yeah.
be cool, but like you want to
Hmm.
commit to 50,000 words
Yeah.
of a form you've never tried before. So like
Hmm.
just try it like in a smaller scale. And maybe,
Hmm.
sometimes you start with something like that. And I've had stories that started off with the like an idea for a form.
Hmm.
And I started writing it and I thought it'd be kind of short, but it just kept going and going and
Hmm.
going and it became its own thing. But I
Hmm.
didn't know that until I tried.
Yeah.
And I think that was really neat.
I also think it's really fun. I love reading books that um, it, it- I don't know how else to phrase this besides like they take a break and have a chapter that is maybe a bit like off balance. So, I'm thinking of Amy Poehler's autobiography. Um, she had a chapter that was written by Tina Fey, and basically the chapter said, like, Amy got really tired of writing, so she asked me to write a chapter for her so that she didn't have to do this, blah, 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 blah. And like, it's this whole thing. But it's like a break in the conversation. And I think that that's so interesting because, if you're writing your book and you just kind of need a fresh start, like you need a little bit of like a jolt of energy as a reader, I think it'd be really interesting to turn the page and you see that there's FAQ that's one chapter long that is completely relevant to your story that like focuses in on it, or the book The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, I believe is what it's called, is written from the perspective of a child who's on the spectrum solving this murder mystery, but they infuse pictures and diagrams and whatever to show how the child thinks, and it makes the story really interesting to read. So I feel like playing with these other forms, like it can still be used towards a bigger story as well as like a way to kind of break it up and revitalize the energy in a novel.
Right. And like again, you can use multiple engines.
Hmm.
So like maybe it starts off as like theme driven, but then you start and like, well, what if it's in this form? And then
Hmm.
you start doing the more of a character driven as the story progresses. But, just find whatever it takes to get you to motivate you, empower your story all the way through because maybe you're
Hmm.
using one specific engine, but it feels like your story just doesn't have like the right oomph, the right power. Maybe it's time to see like what other engine
Hmm.
can I push this forward? Because I've had stories where I was like, I know this character and this plot and where I want them to go, but it didn't hit right. So then I was like, what if I put it in um like a dossier. So it's like a file of a bunch
Hmm.
of like loose articles, and I tell the
Hmm.
story this way, and it gave that story that extra gravity that it needed.
That's so interesting. I love that.
So yeah,
Yeah. And I think another thing to remember is that the engine that's driving you to write might not be the same engine that's driving your reader to read.
yes.
So keeping those kind of separate, I think would also be helpful because I do a first draft as a writer, but I edit as a reader, and it might be more helpful to continue to stay in that writer mindset and then, eventually move to the reader mindset. But I might be putting myself in a box by moving into the reader mindset so quickly.
Mm.
I feel like keeping that writer mindset for a little bit might expand opportunities of, well, how can I switch this up a little bit? How can I find a new engine? How can I test the boundaries a little bit here?
I mean, I think that you could still switch like early,
Hmm.
and as you're reading it, if you find that it's not hitting, like
Yeah.
as a reader, then maybe circle back as a writer and be like,
Hmm.
how can I make this more meaningful in a way
Yeah.
that makes sense to my story?
Hmm. Yeah. I think that's a really good point, is story engines are trying to make your story more meaningful. Like
Mhm.
when it comes down to it, baseline, that's the objective of a story engine, is to infuse meaning into your words.
Yeah, I think so. We've been talking about story engines as a way of propelling the story forward,
Hmm.
but engines also power your car. They're also turning
Hmm.
your radio on, putting your air conditioning on, and that
Yeah.
is also part of the engine, is
Hmm.
it gives your story power.
Hmm.
And so think of it that way, like not only because we can have enough engine power to move the story forward,
Hmm.
but it's not enough power to give something like a meaningful experience.
Right. Just because your car is moving forward doesn't mean that the air conditioning is working and the radio is on and the windows, roll up and down and all the rest of it.
Right. You want to have you want the journey to be comfortable for the reader.
Hmm.
You don't want
Definitely.
them in a car that's like barely getting by and like it's,
An old
you're
jalopy.
an old jalopy and you're in Florida and like the windows don't roll down and you don't have any air conditioning. That's
Oh my God, kill
miserable.
me.
Miserable.
Horrible. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I want to circle back to what you were saying about taking a break because I thought
Hmm.
that's an interesting way of putting it. But I love when I'm reading a book and I think it's going one way, and then
Hmm.
they put in like a section like that
Hmm.
out of the blue because like immediately I stop. I'm like,
Yeah.
what are you doing here?
Hmm.
What are we doing? Because this is exciting. Like I thought I knew what was happening, but this surprised me. And
Yeah.
now I'm interested to see what you're gonna do with this. What is the purpose of this? What are you
Hmm.
trying to communicate with this? And
Yeah.
sometimes it pays off and sometimes it doesn't. But that's
Yes.
again about breaking the rules. You have to
Hmm.
break them well.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
No, I
you
completely
need
agree. I
you
love
need
when
your
books
reader to
do
trust
that.
you.
Yeah. Anything I think that makes me pause as a reader, I think is really useful to a story. Because I think that a lot of us as readers have a habit of just like plowing through trying to get to the end. We always want to find like what happens next, what happens next. So anything that makes us kind of stop and think about what has happened or what the story is trying to say is a really useful tool. And I think that that's going way, 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 way back to a previous episode when we were talking about cliffhangers. I think that's one of the difficulties of cliffhangers, is that sometimes they're used a little bit as a clutch to keep your reader reading. Like people will use cliffhangers as a story engine because, oh, it's just one more chapter, just one more chapter. But if your reader is just plowing through in that way, they might not be absorbing the actual story, or the meaning behind the story.
Right. And I get that also depends on your why. Like if your why
Hmm.
is like, I want people to just eat this up like dessert, like
Yep.
candy,
Hmm.
that's fine. Use that.
Yeah.
But if you want people to like find meaning from this book and
Hmm.
really think about what you're trying to say in the book, I think having like a pause like that would be a really good way of doing that. And maybe the pause is where you're switching gears and maybe you're turning on a different engine
Yeah.
to give that little break. Because what you're doing is like as a reader, if you read a lot, you kind of like become a little jaded. Like you're like, oh, I know how this
Yes.
goes. So when you see
Yes.
something like this, it makes you stop.
Hmm.
And then you're like thinking back to like all the
Hmm.
previous stuff and like, was there other stuff like this that I missed? Like,
Yeah.
and then it makes
Hmm.
you think and maybe makes you go back a little bit. I'm thinking there's
Hmm.
some really I'm thinking of a few books that I've read that have made me feel that way, like
Hmm.
Tamsin Muir's Harrow the Ninth. That's the second book in the trilogy. That one
Hmm.
really that one kind of blew my mind with the way she like
Hmm.
used that story engine to kind of break things
Hmm.
up, break the rules a little bit. And then The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez.
Okay.
Um, both of those books are two books that really surprised me, where a lot of
Hmm.
there's something built into it that made me pause
Hmm.
multiple times in that book to think, okay, what are we doing here? And I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Well, and as we sit and talk about like story engines and things that surprised us, there's a stack of books right here behind me. All of these right here are part of the Georgia Nicholson Confessions, which I don't know. They made a really bad movie adaptation of the first one that's Angus Thongs and Full Frontal Snogging, and it was a Nickelodeon movie. Um, but the whole series is written as a diary from a like 14-year-old girl.
Mhm.
And the books cover like 2 years of her life. Um, but they are written like thinking about it, I would be like, oh, they're character driven because it's all from her perspective and about her friends and blah, blah, blah. But the real story engine is the fact that it's set up like a diary and it has, like she'll write things like, 10 a.m. Went downstairs to get breakfast. We didn't have this, so I ended up eating that instead, blah, blah, blah. 10:02, left breakfast nook because dad farted. And like that kind of like funny beat, like you don't get that just from reading the story. The fact that it's 2 minutes later,
Yeah.
like that's the part that makes it funny. So that is the story engine being used there. And again, I wouldn't have thought of that as a story engine, but it is. It's what's keeping me reading, and it's probably what was keeping her writing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, again, like my whole thing in grad school was form. There's so
Hmm.
many cool things that you can show in form that you
Hmm.
can't really just show in a traditionally formatted narrative.
Yeah.
So I would highly recommend playing around with it. It's a lot of fun. So, as
Hmm.
a technical writer, I wrote like articles and stuff, and I'm like, a how-to guide would be a really interesting story. I know how to
Hmm.
write a how-to guide. I know that back and forward. I know like writing a technical manual, like how could you tell a story that way? It's just such an
Hmm.
interesting way of thinking of what kind of story you could tell that way. And even like if you and I both like did a thing where it's like we're both going to write a how-to article, but
Hmm.
we're going to tell a story, we
Yeah.
would come up with completely different stories.
Absolutely. And again, I think that that would fall back to our traditional story engines, where one might be more plot driven and one might be more character driven. With the writing group that I started at the bookstore, um, when we talked about this idea of story engines, I had them do a writing exercise where they just had to write about somebody cooking. Like that was just the whatever, they just had to write about somebody cooking. And then we talked about the differences that some people focused in on the act of cooking and reading the recipe and measuring the ingredients and stirring and whisking. And some people focus on the character of like, they are a world famous chef who glide easily through the kitchen, or they are a frantic dad trying to cook dinner for their 2 year old. Um, and even just that very, very basic prompt shows, which one you might be more inclined to. And so I think that you're right. Given the same form or the same prompt,
Mhm.
we are going to write completely different stories um, that are going to use multiple different engines.
Yeah, I think it would be a cool thing if you're struggling with writer's block or you have a story that feels stuck,
Hmm.
is take that same story and rewrite it or like part of it
Hmm.
with a completely different engine
Yeah.
and see
Yeah.
what that does for you. Because maybe that engine
Hmm.
doesn't work for you, but maybe it'll
Hmm.
give you some insights into what should be happening or what's missing.
Yeah. And as we're sitting here talking about these different forms and these different story engines, I'm literally taking notes um, of like how I can insert this into my second novel, thinking about things like inserting a chapter that's just a police report of like the formal police report of the mother's arrest, or inserting like the diagram of how the underground bunker works,
Hmm.
and almost making it a bit more technical in that way, um, by having those forced breaks. Like you are giving me so many ideas of
I love
how
that.
to integrate a different story engine that will help the whole thing move forward.
Yeah, because then it also kind of lends itself to assuming your audience is intelligent and
Yes.
they're going to be able to extrapolate
Hmm.
why that piece of information is there.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about The Blind Assassin by Margaret
Hmm.
Atwood. Have you read that?
No.
I would recommend reading it.
Yeah.
I think it's a very character-driven story,
Hmm.
but there's two main narratives. It's like there's a story about a woman, and then there's a story of this couple, and I think maybe he is telling a story of like a pulp sci-fi type story.
Ooh.
and
Uh-huh.
he's just making it up as he goes along,
Mm-hmm.
kind of lends to the other narrative
Mm-hmm.
that's going through and kind of building on the characters and the ideas that are happening. And I just thought that was such an interesting way of weaving that in there, that it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
like this metaphorical story, but working with, and there's also like there's like newspaper articles. I think that's how it starts. And then I think
Mm-hmm.
it ends with an obituary. So like has these little inserts
Yeah.
and things like that, and these two different parallel forms informing the other one and revealing character that way.
Mm-hmm. That's
Very
so
cool book.
interesting. Yeah. Well, and we've talked a lot about using form or format as a story engine. But I also think that things like exploring dialogue or setting as a story engine is really, really informative. I have a exercise with my students that I'll do that is have two characters walk into a room and interact with the same object. And like you would think of that as being character driven because it's revealing something about the character, but really focusing on like the setting and how they interact with their surroundings, I think is the focus of it because you want to think about like what is around these people to reveal something about the character. Again, it's the difference of like you are using the story engine of setting to reveal something about character.
Mm, that's very interesting. I think I've been talking about formula just because that's something I'm
Right,
familiar with.
yeah.
But I remember doing an exercise where the exercise was to write a story with dialogue only.
Oh, I love that exercise.
And that
Mm-hmm.
I think would be how you would do a
Mm-hmm.
dialogue driven narrative. I think that's totally
Mm-hmm.
possible.
Yeah.
And I think in a way, when I worked on that documentary story
Mm-hmm.
that I was working on, I think in a way that was writing
Yeah.
a dialogue driven story because in the beginning, all I didn't have the camera parts in there,
Mm-hmm.
like showing direction. So it was just like two people talking. And they weren't
Yep.
even talking to each other. It's a documentary, so
Yeah.
they're just conversations that are next to each other.
Yep.
But, there's ways you can play with that and
Mm-hmm.
that kind of like box you put yourself in, which is a
Mm-hmm.
challenge. Like, how do I tell a story
Yeah.
when the only thing I can do is talk, which
Mm-hmm.
can be boring.
Mm-hmm.
But I think about, I don't know, have you seen BoJack Horseman?
Bits of it. It's pretty depressing.
It's very depressing. There's one episode,
Mm-hmm.
the entire episode is a monologue.
Oh
And there's
God.
nothing else happens. He just stands there and talks the entire episode. And it is so good. It's one of the best
Mm-hmm.
episodes. And it's mind-boggling that a cartoon can
Mm-hmm.
have somebody just standing and talking and that be a successful episode. But I think that's kind of an example of what drives your plot forward is even though
Mm-hmm.
it may seem boring to just
Mm-hmm.
have dialogue, if you do it well, you can get away
Mm-hmm.
with it.
Well, and not only that, but again, as we talk about like using these different ideas in small forms and then spreading it into larger forms if you want, writing a story that is only dialogue is a really, really interesting exercise to do, but then translating that into a greater work where you are heavily focused on the dialogue. You are forcing your characters to think out loud and interact with one another. Like, I think that that's a really interesting thing because you can have a novel that has the other elements, but the base for, the engine driving it forward is these characters having to interact with one another out loud. And I think that that's where we get a lot of fun with like miscommunication tropes. Or different things like that, where like, when you think about dialogue, people very rarely talk to one another. Like each person has their own agenda when having a conversation. I mean, even when you and I do this podcast, we bounce back and forth off of each other. We get ideas from one another and then we kind of move forward with our own points and stuff.
Right.
That's how people talk. And so forcing yourself to practice that with a dialogue only and then you can move it into a greater form. Like, I don't want people to think that you can only have these different engines in short form. I think that you can have different engines in a long form as well.
Absolutely.
You're just going to have more than one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And maybe you don't though, but I think that'd
Yeah.
be more challenging.
Yes.
It's just what are you willing to take on? Where do you
Hmm.
think your skills are at? But I
Hmm.
think experimenting with these different engines and finding what works for you
Hmm.
or an engine that you want to explore and
Hmm.
just it's just more tools in your tool bag, you
Hmm.
know? Just be a don't be uncomfortable to grab some other tool out of your tool bag. If you like, you're like, I know these tools work for me. Great. But maybe you get a little stuck, or maybe you're
Yep.
a little bored. Grab one
Hmm.
of your other tools.
Yeah.
Try
Always, I
it. You
mean,
never know.
you can always expand your utility belt or your bag of holding. Like there's always more room.
Exactly. There's always more room. You don't have to use it, but I think it's fun to try.
Hmm.
And even if like you try a different story engine and you're like, I could
Hmm.
not do this. There's stuff you're going to learn too about yourself and your writing just by having done the exercise.
Yeah. Well, it's like you and I have talked about before. All writing is useful. Like even
Yes.
if it doesn't end up in your story, even if it, gets deleted immediately, like any time that you spend putting words to paper, or computer or whatever is time well spent because you are
Totally agree.
exercising that muscle.
Absolutely. And, I think this episode's been really fun to just
Hmm.
kind of talk about and explore different ways that you can create story. It's not limited to the binary that we
Hmm.
think or we're taught it was.
Yeah, it really expanded my mind of like different story engines and again the difference between like a writer's engine versus a reader's engine. Like I think that that's a really important differentiation that I've never thought about before.
Yeah, that I got really excited reading that article because
Hmm.
again, like there are things that I've always thought, but like didn't really
Hmm.
have never had articulated to me in that
Hmm.
way. And it really got me excited to write. And I love
Hmm.
that you were taking notes for your project that you're working on
Yeah.
because it just kind of shows you that just being in that
Hmm.
headspace and learning and being able to talk about craft can help you, if nothing else,
Hmm.
inspire you to get writing.
Definitely. Will you shout out, I know that you already shouted out the author, but what is the article title and where can it be found?
Okay, so it is called On the Many Different Engines That Power a Short Story, specifically.
Hmm.
And this is by Lincoln Michael, and it is on lithub.com.
Awesome. Thank you. Because I'm going to go look that up.
I mean, I can share the link,
Yeah. And we can
find a way to
put it.
distribute that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, hold on. Yeah. Anything else?
I don't think so. I think that we really, covered all of our bases. I'm really excited about this Back to Basics series that we're going to be doing. And it's not, going to be every episode. It's not going to be all in a row either, but just on occasion, I think it's really nice for us to refocus on the basics of storytelling. And I think that we've proven certainly that it helps expand our own writing. Even though you and I have been doing this for years, there's always something new to learn, and always a different thing to practice.
Yeah, I think too, like, there's no rule book that, like, there's no textbook that every creative writing teacher is given, and like, this is how
Hmm.
you teach people to write a story. And so I think that we're drawing on, we've had very different experiences, and we can kind of, take those foundational rules and see what we've learned and how we've grown to understand
Exactly.
them since we learned about them.
Yep, absolutely. I'm Abigail,
And I'm Maddie, and this has been
two writers.
Many Wrongs.